What does the future hold for the Islamic State militant group? Is it retreating, and how much of a global threat does it still pose? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Islamic State, also called ISIL or Daesh, has suffered a string of defeats in Syria and Iraq in the last few months. And over the weekend, ISIL fighters were forced out of the ancient city of Palmyra by Syrian government forces. But last week, ISIL also claimed responsibility for the terrorist attacks that killed 35 people in Brussels. So is the war against ISIL causing it to retreat? How much of a threat does the group still pose? In a few minutes, I will talk with a panel of experts who study jihadist movements, but we begin with CCTV correspondent Natalie Carney, who filed this report from Istanbul, Turkey.
It wasn't that long ago that ISIL appeared invincible. Not anymore. The Iraqi army is preparing an offensive to retake the country's second-largest city, Mosul, which has been under ISIL control for almost 2 years. Iraqi forces took back control of another ISIL stronghold, Ramadi, in December. With Russian support, Syrian troops recaptured the city of Palmyra, opening a strategic corridor for an assault into the heart of the so-called Islamic State, including its self-proclaimed capital, Raqqa. The Pentagon says ISIL has lost around 40% of its territory in Iraq and Syria since 2014. But as it loses momentum in the Middle East, ISIL terrorists have lashed out at unarmed civilians in Europe.
They are desperate. That's why they are pursuing two strategies right now. First of them is what we see in Brussels and before in Paris, to show the foreign militants in their territory that they are controlling, that it's a great force to be part of. And the other strategy they are pursuing right now is trying to gain ground in other countries.
Countries like Libya. ISIL has been taking advantage of the chaos there since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. And in neighboring Tunisia, a gunman massacred 38 tourists on a beach last June. Tunisia's struggling economy has made it a prime recruiting ground.
There is still very high unemployment in the Tunisian youth. So that's why it's also a source of new foreign fighters, because young people are very desperate. They don't see any future for them, and they can be vulnerable for the ISIS propaganda.
By government estimates, around 3,000 Tunisians are fighting with ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Many have also joined ISIL in Libya. And according to the United Nations, ISIL militants are operating in 25 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces.
Turkey, too, is under considerable threat. In the last 8 months alone, nearly 150 people have been killed in ISIL attacks in some of the most popular and populated places in major cities across the country. And ISIL have threatened to kill more.
Few would know the threat ISIL poses better than Bunyamin Aygun. The Turkish photojournalist was kidnapped and tortured by the extremists in northern Syria for more than a month.
ISIL may be the most well-organized group in the world. It isn't very important for them to have land. The ideology is more important. If they sacrifice their territories, they will just go underground. Then they will suddenly appear when we are not waiting. It could be in other countries, such as in Belgium and before in France, in Ankara, in Istanbul. They will appear in unpredicted places.
Yet ISIL will still need money to run such operations, but its money appears to be running out. U.S. coalition and Russian airstrikes have targeted the group's oil assets, cutting off a key source of income. The refugee exodus has hurt too. Fewer people means less tax to collect. The group has been forced to cut costs. Leaked ISIL documents show the militants have slashed fighter salaries by up to 50%. Military operations at the Turkish border have also choked off supplies and potential recruits to ISIL's so-called caliphate. Despite these obvious setbacks, support for ISIL and their strategies continue.
ISIL will put on their agenda other big countries, like America and England, countries they haven't been able to hit so far, so they can show themselves and remind everyone that we are still here. Europe, America and Turkey will always be on their target.
Natalie Carney, CCTV, Istanbul, Turkey.
Joining me from London is Abdel Bari Atwan. He is editor-in-chief of the Arab opinion website, Rai Al-Yum. He's also the founder and former editor of Al-Quds Al-Arabi newspaper. Also with me here in the studio is Tawfiq Hamid. He is a former member of an Islamic militant group in Egypt, and he's the author of Inside Jihad. Joining us too from Washington is Lorenzo Vedina. He is the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. He studies the mobilization of jihadist networks. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's start in London with Abdel Bari Atwan. Abdel, Syrian government forces last week pushed Islamic State out of Palmyra, that ancient city. It was the latest defeat by that group. The Pentagon here in Washington is now telling us that ISIL has lost up to 40% of territory it once controlled. How damaging are these military defeats for ISIL?
Well, I believe it is extremely damaging. To lose a city like Palmyra is a huge loss for the Islamic State, and we have to remember that. They are under tremendous pressure in other places, and there is Zur and Raqqa. And at the same time, there is a parallel campaign taking place in Iraq now. Iraqi forces with Peshmerga, the Kurdish Peshmerga, under the cover also supported by air cover by United States and even special forces, American special forces on the ground. They are about to actually attack Mosul, the spring attack to regain Mosul. So I believe the Islamic State, for the first time since it's actually surfaced on the news, under tremendous pressure, and they lost more than 400 fighters in Palmyra. So it seems, I believe, they are in retreat to lose 40% of the territory they originally used to control. I think this is again a huge setback for them. Whether this kind of losses will continue or not, it depends on what will happen. But I believe actually there is a plan to root them out completely from Syria and from Iraq, maybe by this spring, maximum by the end of this year.
Lorenzo, do you think that ISIL is now on the run? They still control a big city like Raqqa and control large parts of Syria and Iraq, as we know. How concerned do you think they are over these losses?
No, we're clearly very concerned. I mean, these are major territorial losses, and it's true that there's a campaign up and coming. There's a sort of a coming storm here, and I think particularly in Iraq, with the forces really going all the way up to Mosul, it's difficult to say what the outcome of those upcoming battles are going to be, but it's clearly there's a mounting pressure there. Add to that the targeted, the killing, the operations that special forces, American, British, and others have been conducting, the pounding they've been getting from the Russians. I think they are extremely concerned. I think to some degree they're having more problems in smuggling in fighters from the Turkish border. There's a lot of pressure there. That doesn't mean that it's something where we should say that ISIS is over. I think hardly. I think there are going to be areas where they're definitely going to put on a big fight before they give up. And listen, even if you're assuming that they're going to get defeated in terms of control of territory, it's clear that they're going to turn into an insurgency group, which is what Al-Qaeda in Iraq, sort of the forerunner of ISIS was. They're not going to disappear, they're not going to evaporate, they're going to be there and just sort of be in the shadows and operate as an insurgency group. And we saw that for 10 years in Iraq, how lethal that was.
Tawfiq, what's important to ISIL? Is it holding territory or spreading its ideology?
I believe basically spreading the ideology, because when you spread the ideology, it will allow you, if you lost territory, to go move somewhere else to start your process. Like, for example, I'm sure many of us will remember that the Taliban was defeated by the US and the coalition years and years ago. And this was not the end of the Taliban. Now the Taliban is coming back, and actually the ideology started to create another radical Islamic groups in other parts of the world. So defeating them geographically in certain location, we have already an experience that it was not the end of the story, because they can start a new story at other parts of the world as long as their ideology exists in these parts.
Abdel, what about the point that Islamic State wants to create, well, an Islamic State, a caliphate? If they lose territory, they're not going to have that state. They will, as Lorenzo pointed out, become an insurgency. Is it key, is it vital to them that they have that state to be able to operate?
Well, actually, what's the strategy of the Islamic State? First is to consolidate their grip on the lands they control, and then to expand. So if we look at the map now, Middle Eastern map, they are expanding in more than 20 countries, and the most important one is Libya now. And they are actually establishing some sort of a new bases, Emirates in Sirte, in Kufra in the south of Libya, Derna and the Green Mountain in the east of Libya. So they are expanding, and I agree with Lorenzo and Washington that those people will go underground. They are not going to evaporate completely. Also, Mr. Tawfiq clearly right when he said, the Taliban was defeated maybe about 15 years ago, but they are coming back, and they are now in control of more than 60 to 70% of Afghanistan. So we should not write them off completely. Those people, they are very, very experienced, and they are deeply rooted in the area, especially in Iraq. And we know that they are ex-Saddam Hussein Republican Guards, colonels and generals. They have a huge experience. So I agree, we should not actually say this is the end of them. They know how to actually to change their strategy from time to time. We noticed the attacks on France and Belgium recently. I believe they are adopting now the strategy of Al-Qaeda, which to hit their enemies where it hurts. I mean, their capitals, to create havoc, instability, and to control the media also by these kind of attacks. So we have to be very careful here. Yes, the Russian, the American, and there are 60 other countries are fighting them, but in the same time they will fight until the end, and this kind of war could be very costly. I'm talking about in human terms, both in the Islamic State or actually on the attackers, especially who are sending troops on the ground.
Right, Lorenzo, is this a strategic change by ISIS to say we will choose the battlefield where we are going to wage this war? If it's not going to be in Iraq, Syria or Libya, then we will take it to you. We'll take it to places like Brussels and Paris.
Well, I think what we're finding out from the investigations, the attacks, is that ISIS in reality has been kind of preparing for this for a long time. The network of operatives in Europe in particular was basically planned some year and a half, if not 2 years ago, to have people in place there, whether because they were already foreseeing sort of the attack coming from the West and then having this retaliation mechanism, or anyways because they wanted to strike anyways because they hate the West. I think it really matters little, but they've been planning for this for a long time. Obviously, the more they lose territory there, the more they have an interest in weakening the spirit of Western countries and carrying out attacks. When they do that, when they carry out attacks like in Paris or Brussels, in the West in general, the goal is twofold. Is one, to sort of weaken the will of European governments and populations in attacking them. It's sort of sending the message, let us be in Syria and Iraq, and we won't attack you anymore. And the other part is obviously sort of a polarizing, radicalizing effect on European society and on European Muslim communities. But that strategy has been in place for a long time. At the end of the day, they kind of knew that eventually the West and an international coalition was going to attack, and they kind of wanted there. They are now obviously basically triggering those attacks. They are basically activating those operatives that have been undercover for a long time. But you got to give it to ISIS. They've been planning this for quite a long time.
Tawfiq, where does ISIS get its money and weapons from? I mean, we've heard stories about ISIS raising money through smuggling oil. If they lose territory, they're not going to have much of that ability left.
This will certainly affect them.
Right.
But remember, they always have a chance to find a source of money through people who are motivated by the same ideology and are wealthy, for example. And also they can do a lot of criminal acts. They justify actually doing this, like smuggling addictive drugs, for example, or whatever. They will find a way to find some money. Of course, affecting the oil will significantly affect their capabilities. But what I'm saying is what's happening is fine and great, but we cannot be very optimistic about it because it's not complete yet.
Right. Abdel Bari Atwan, ISIL has been very successful in recruiting people from all over the world. Is it still as successful? Is its recruitment campaign still working?
Well, it's not working as it used to be, say, 2 years ago, simply because the intelligence services all over the world are after them. And I believe they used to have, for example, 50,000 accounts, 50 to 100,000 accounts on the internet, on the Twitter, and also the same thing on Facebook. Now, actually, this figures cut to less than 30 to 20,000 accounts because there were a lot of campaigns in order to prevent them from reaching the whole of the world and spreading their ideology, and also using the social media for the recruitments of new fighters and new experts in order to boost the state and all their departments. So yes, they are losing now because the people, the international community, the intelligence services are aware of their danger. The problem is, in the past, most of the government used to concentrate on actually mosques and trying to prevent these mosques to turn as a recruitment arms for the radical organization, Islamic organization. Now, I believe it is not the imams, it is actually the imam Twitters and the Sheikh Facebook who are actually the major tool of the Islamic State or ISIL to recruit people. The recruitment process is much less than it used to be, simply because of the awareness of the danger of the Islamic State, and also because the media actually exposed a lot of these kind of methods and enlighten people about the danger of this organization. And also the Muslim communities, especially in the West, are under pressure, under surveillances from the governments, from the security forces. So I believe their job now to recruit people is not as it used to be, say, 2 years ago. It is definitely struggling. They are struggling now to recruit people.
Right, Lorenzo, do numbers really matter? Because as we saw in Brussels, it would take only just 2 or 3 people to cause the kind of mayhem and destruction and death that these ISIL members caused in that city. Recently we heard that there's something like 400 trained fighters already deployed in Europe by ISIL. How big a threat are they to Europe?
Well, clearly very big. I think the reality is that the numbers do matter. You're right that terrorism is a small numbers game. It takes just 1 or 2 operatives to really wreak havoc in a European city. But I think one of the reasons why European agencies are struggling so much, even though, keep in mind, there's been a very high number of attacks thwarted by European intelligence agencies. I think we're reading a lot of criticism of European law enforcement intelligence agencies, but for every Paris and Brussels, there have been dozens of attacks have been thwarted over the last few months. But one of the reasons they are struggling is because the numbers of people that are coming back is so high. Think of Belgium. I mean, the Belgians have made a lot of mistakes, there's no denying that, but they have very tiny numbers of people in law enforcement intelligence. Belgian intelligence has 600 active officers. There are 600 Belgians who went and fought for ISIS, and 200 of them probably came back. So with that small number of people, you have to monitor an equal number of people who are potentially dangerous. So that's why the numbers do matter. The fact that we have, again, nobody really knows the exact numbers, but we're talking about 1,000 people who came back, and probably, and clearly, some of them trained to carry out operations. Not everybody that comes back will be a danger. Some will come back and will have no desire to be involved in terrorist activities, but some obviously are dispatched to carry out activities. Because the numbers are so high, and some of them are quite well trained, as we've seen, it's very difficult for European authorities to cope with that.
Okay, we're going to have to take a short break right now. More on ISIL and its ongoing threat when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the militant group ISIL, also called Daesh. Do recent military setbacks mean it is in decline, or do last week's terrorist attacks in Brussels prove it's as deadly as ever? Let's get back to our panel. Tawfiq, you talked a moment ago about Libya and the fact that ISIL has now got a foothold over there. To what extent should we blame countries like France and the United States for reducing Libya to a failed state, allowing ISIL to move in and take over?
It's certainly a major factor in what we see today is the existence of a place like Libya and maybe other places that does not have strong governing body. And I trust that the Europeans and the US, when they interfered in Libya, the initial step were relatively successful, removing al-Qaddafi, for example. But typically, as what happened before in Iraq, the second step was incorrect. They just leave the place in chaotic situation, and this allows a lot of organizations like ISIL and others to grow there and cause a lot of trouble all over the world. Especially the technology develops naturally it develops. So even with small number of people now who are very dedicated with this technological developments and advances, you can have major damage to the whole world economy and security and stability by just using certain technology. And when you have chaos or chaotic area, you allow a lot of smuggling of the money, training camps to exist. So I believe the US and European countries now has some responsibility to try to bring Libya under a reasonable controlling body some way or another.
Abdel, what is your view on that? Did the United States and its allies effectively shoot themselves in their collective foot by bombing Libya, killing Gaddafi, and then leaving this power vacuum that was taken by ISIL?
Yes, first, once you have a military intervention in a country in the Middle East, you create a failed state, you create a vacuum. Who is actually the strongest party to fill this vacuum? Usually radical Islamic organization or terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And that's what happened in Libya, that's what happened in Iraq, that's what happened in Syria, and that's what's happening in Yemen also. So this is the major problem. Yes, I believe the Americans committed a grave mistake when they toppled Gaddafi without preparing the ground for better alternative. The American and the European, they had a plan A, which is to topple Gaddafi, but they never had a plan B, what to do to the country after they topple Gaddafi. And this is their gravest mistake. And President Obama, in his actually interview to Atlantic magazine, he admitted that they made mistakes and he regretted even intervening in Libya. So I believe the same thing is happening in other parts of the Middle East. So what will happen after they root out ISIS, for example? What's the alternative for the people of Mosul, the people of Anbar, the people of Raqqa, the people of Deir ez-Zor? What will happen there? So I believe, yes, the military intervention causing all these kind of problems, and I believe that the West American and Europeans actually shot themselves in the foot, and now they are paying a heavy price. They have to go back again to Libya to try to fix what they broke in that country. No government, no army, no security forces, no services, no electricity, no education, nothing at all. When Libya was a functioning country for more than 50 years or so. So I believe now what they are going to do, there are talks about military intervention again. Whether this will succeed or not, I believe if there is no proper plan for Libya, as a whole, to make stability, to make people feel that this kind of intervention is actually bearing fruits, I believe we will be in the same circle.
Lorenzo, I want to move on to something else now. And there's been a lot of concern expressed that ISIL may be targeting nuclear plants in Europe, or they could set off a dirty bomb. I mean, how does Europe respond to this, especially countries like Belgium, which depend on nuclear power? France depends a lot on nuclear power. Does it look at mass surveillance of its population, tightening up security even further to protect themselves?
To some degree, yes, but this is in reality nothing really new. In the immediate days after 9/11, so we're talking about 2001, in Belgium it was discovered a plot by a known Al-Qaeda affiliate to target the nuclear power plant there. I mean, the fact that nuclear power plants have been hypothetical targets for jihadist groups is something known. Al-Qaeda was making plans for it 15 years ago. It's no surprise that ISIS is doing the same. So obviously there is heightened security dating back to at least 9/11 days, if not before that. I think what is more of concern is obviously the soft targets and the fact that it's impossible, basically, even in those that are potentially not really that soft, like the airport and particularly the part where the the US bound flights check in. And the metro in one of the stations, which is right close to the institutions, was basically targets that were open. I think that's the more likely reality, rather than the nuclear scenario, which is obviously extremely frightening, and I'm sure some of the measures have been heightened, but I think the security has been there for a while. The reality is that the number of targets is the number of potential targets is basically endless. What authorities are working on is not so much surveillance of communities, but trying to zero in on the networks. And I think what you see in many cases is a problem of, yes, failed intelligence sharing, limited resources, but also one of the dilemmas that democratic societies face. A lot of these individuals that carry out attacks are known to authorities as extremists. They've been on the radar screen. Yet one thing is knowing somebody from an intelligence point of view, knowing that somebody is radicalized, knowing that somebody is an extremist. Another thing is having evidence enough to arrest him and charge him. And I think a lot of people are in that limbo, and our authorities are in this very frustrating situation where they observe and monitor a lot of people, they cannot arrest them. Obviously, in a democracy, that's how it works. And you know, we can argue what the limits of the balance between security needs and civil rights is, but that's the dynamic that a lot of authorities face.
Tawfiq, looking at one part of a political solution, what are the prospects for a peace agreement in Syria right now?
It's beginning to be possible, but I always see the Sunni groups will be an obstacle because it's hard for them to accept the Alawites to control them. So I see the possibility of confederation or some federal areas within the country, like Iraq when it was Kurdish area, Sunni area, Shia area, something like that with common interests may work. But I'm not sure if it can come back under the control, full control of the Alawite regime. I'm not sure of this.
Abdel Bari Atwan, very quickly, I've got 20 seconds. What should the United States and its allies be doing right now that they're not doing to defuse this crisis?
Well, actually, they are trying to do by involving Russia actually and Iran, incorporate them in the peace process. This is a huge success, and it started to bear fruits in Syria and also in Iraq itself. So I believe the understanding between American and between Russian together, they can actually reach some sort of a political solution which can at least reduce the damages and reduce the bloodshed, if not preventing it completely. So I believe giving terrorism the priority is also another success, which, and if they continue with the same route, I think the situation could be much better.
Okay, Abdel Bari Atwan, Tawfiq Hamid, Lorenzo Vidino, thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.